Hello, this is the first summary lecture for Art 102, so a course going from Renaissance to Rococo and into the neoclassical period. So we'll be starting off thinking about defining the Renaissance and introducing a few pieces of art that exemplify some of these new Renaissance characteristics that are coming up into art. So first off, the Renaissance means, or the term Renaissance means rebirth. It's a term in French that is this word for rebirth, and it refers to a cultural revival of Greek and Roman classical antiquity, so ancient Greece and ancient Rome, an appreciation or a new appreciation for that style, but also for the literature from that period, stories from that period. The Renaissance is a period that remains very firmly Christian for the most part in Europe, remains very Christian, but is demonstrating a new appreciation or renewed appreciation for those cultures. It's also a time of discovery, scientific advancement. A lot of other areas of culture are also experiencing renewal. But in this course, of course, we will be focusing on the visual arts. So this idea of rebirth is very, very important. The period before the Renaissance, we see the Gothic style as very popular. So in some of the lectures from Art 101, you can see some lectures on the Gothic style. But just a quick review, the term Gothic, of course, was a derogatory term used in Italy to refer to this style of the Middle Ages, this style that was popular in France and other areas in Northern Europe, although we do see it a little bit in Italy, and we'll be identifying some of those features. But this is kind of seen as the old style. This is the style that's going out of fashion once the Renaissance style is coming in. This is seen as more of a style of that medieval period that becomes associated with what are called the Dark Ages, but we don't really use that term as much anymore. So this term Goth was a negative term, so the Goths were these Germanic tribes that were said to have, or that caused the fall of Rome in the 5th century. But essentially it was associated with a barbaric idea, with the Italians thinking of themselves as very refined and part of this ancient culture of ancient Rome and the ancient Mediterranean, and thinking of these northern cultures as more barbaric. So what are some of the important concepts to note about the Renaissance? What other changes are going on? So first off, we see a renewed interest in the human face and human body. So in the medieval period, we often see the body associated with sin. We see it very covered up. We see the body hidden so that people can't have sinful thoughts about it, or very stylized or elongated. But in the Renaissance, we're going to see a renewed interest in making these body types very natural or close to nature, making them look more real, and also studying the face and studying the individual. We see a renewed interest, as I mentioned, in ancient Greece and Rome, so a renewed appreciation of these ancient cultures and the art styles of these cultures, and an interest in fame, so individual fame. We often talk about humanism being associated with the Renaissance, and this is an appreciation of humans and the human experience, literature. When we think of the humanities, we're thinking of ideas of humanism and an interest in individuals. So what we see in the Renaissance is an interest in fame. We actually start learning a lot about individual artists that we didn't know about during the medieval period. So it's great that we have this renewed interest, because it fleshes out our understanding of this period a lot more. And it's not unlike our current period or today, where people are very interested in individual fame. And a final characteristic is intense civic engagement. So an interest in developing the Italian city-state. Italy was quite fragmented at this time, and we see a lot of participatory governments where certain male citizens of a city were permitted to participate in different governing bodies. And this is unlike periods in the medieval age, when you're seeing, or the medieval period, when you're seeing primarily kings and queens and nobles and things like that. You're seeing a slightly more open form of government in the Renaissance in Italy. So when we're analyzing Renaissance art, there's a couple of key things to look at, to examine. We see things like artist handbooks during this time, and we'll be examining these over the course of the class. Mathematical treatises, which help artists with things like perspective, artist biographies, which illuminate this idea of fame being really important, autobiographies, so artists promoting themselves in their own autobiographies. We can examine letters, inventories, wills. We also examine the literature and philosophical contributions of the time. So here I just have listed an example, Machiavelli's The Prince, as an example of something to look at when considering this time period. So here's a map of Italy around the time of the early Renaissance, which gives you a sense of the fragmentary nature of the Italian peninsula. It was not unified as it is today, but you can see it's a lot of small duchies, a lot of small kind of states. So you have the Kingdom of Naples, the Pope had his own territories in central Italy, and then you had a lot of city-states like Florence and Siena, and then these duchies up here. So important to note that it is very fragmented. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples of art that demonstrate this kind of hybridity between Gothic and then Renaissance, and then in a bit we're going to look at an example that combines more Byzantine and Renaissance. So our first example thinks about the Gothic style and then incorporating some of this revival of antiquity. And this piece is Nicola Pisano's Pulpit for the Baptistery of Pisa. So the baptistery was a separate structure that was close to the cathedral where all citizens would go to be baptized and essentially to become a citizen of a city. So it has some medieval or Gothic elements, things like these trefoil arches here, these bushy column capitals, these animals down below. These are reminiscent of the medieval period, some Gothic elements. But if we look up at these rectangular relief sculptures, we can clearly see that these are reminiscent of ancient Roman sarcophagi and other Roman relief sculpture. So let's zoom in on one of them. If we see here, it's another key work or another part that that you should be familiar with. So this is Nicola Pisano's Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration of the Shepherds. It clearly has some ancient Roman inspiration here. We're seeing heavy drapery, very naturalized forms, heavy figures. We can see their bodies underneath the drapery. You can see the legs here. You can see the bodies underneath this drapery throughout. And we can see, again, the bodies are natural. Even the hair is done in a very ancient Roman type of style. Kind of the drilling of the hair, the facial hair of the beard is reminiscent of the kind of bust portraiture that we would see in ancient Rome. So we are combining three stories into one, into a continuous narrative, because we do see the Virgin repeated. We also see the Christ child repeated. So first we have the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel arriving, telling the Virgin the news that she's pregnant. Also, this is sometimes called the Incarnation, where the Christ becomes incarnate in her womb. Moving on to the next stage, obviously the Nativity, this moment where the Virgin has given birth, she's resting, she's reclining. We see her here. So this is kind of the before, and this is the after. You see the Christ child being bathed, and then you see Joseph off to the side. And then in this other corner up here, you see the Adoration of the Shepherds. The Christ child's now all bundled up, and we see angel figures as well as the shepherds coming to adore Christ. So also in the Renaissance, we see an interest in emotion and in more expression. So we're seeing these figures that are kind of breaking out of the restraints of the medieval period, which tends to be pretty stiff and pretty stylized, and allowing for more emotion. So we clearly see that in how the Virgin is pulling back in surprise when she's hearing this message of the time of the Incarnation. So she's pulling back here. Also, we see her looking very peaceful here, while Joseph looks kind of bewildered. But basically making these figures come to life a bit more. This quest for naturalism, or sometimes called mimesis, an imitation of life. All right, so we've thought a little about the Gothic style, which tended to be more ornate. We saw it in those trefoil arches and in the column capitals. But we also have the Byzantine style, which has some of the stylization and also the gold backgrounds that we associate with this period. So an artist who was definitely inspired by Byzantine art and icons was Cimabue. But Cimabue was known as an artist who was really beginning some of these proto-Renaissance characteristics. So first, let's start off by thinking about the Byzantine elements. So first off, we've got a gold background. We also have figures that look relatively stiff in certain cases. The angels don't look that dynamic. They're slightly moving around. But pretty traditional, pretty conservative in its representation. But let's think a little bit about how maybe it's becoming a little more naturalistic. So the throne's taking up some space, a little bit of dimension. So we often think of that as having some Renaissance characteristics to it. He's trying to make the throne really occupy space in a more natural way. Also, the Virgin has a little bit of modeling, a little bit of form around her chin, also the Christ child. So this allows the forms to look slightly more three-dimensional. So while we're not to the point of what we'll see with Giotto, for example, next week, Giotto was actually a student of Cimabue's, we're starting to see a movement towards more life being brought and more naturalism being brought into these paintings. So gold background, kind of stiff stylization, relatively traditional representation of the Virgin, very Byzantine, but allowing for more dimension, more naturalism. That's very Renaissance. All right, our final topic is just to think about civic pride and architectural patronage, and I just want to compare two cities, Siena and Florence, two cities that were very close to each other, that were often in competition in central Italy, in the area of Tuscany. So if we look at Siena, we can see the cathedral kind of from this elevated view, and you can see it has a bell tower, it had an area for the baptistery that's kind of hidden here, but you can see that it is a large cathedral, but it's one that they were continually adding to. One of the things that these cities were often trying to accomplish was to create the largest church, in Christendom. So we often see cities with this type of goal. And Siena's cathedral is very interesting because they were continually adding on to it. Churches took a long time to build. So you had this original church, then they added 2 more bays to it, and eventually they were going to add a whole nother section here, creating a new cruciform plan, kind of reorienting it in a different direction. But with things like the plague and the city really never recovering so much from that, this was never finished. But let me just show you the interior. Both the interior and the exterior demonstrate this preference for black and white striping, which actually the kind of the standard colors for Siena was this black and white crest. So it's definitely a sign of civic pride in the fact that their city colors are there. Okay, so we can see on the inside the same kind of striping, and then this is the portion that was never finished. So this is the church here, how it stands today, but the idea was they were going to add this whole area here, creating a new and larger church. They were going to reorient the entire church. You can even see how they're getting started with that black and white striping, but they never finished this one. So it shows us that they had big goals, but unfortunately were not able to accomplish them. Another kind of similar story is the Florence Cathedral. However, they were able to accomplish eventually closing off the dome, and we'll cover that in a few weeks. But when they first built it, they built it so large and with such a large space for the dome that they were unable to finish it. So let's have a look at kind of how this church grew. It started off as a relatively small church to a saint, Santa Reparata, who was a local saint, and then it began to grow under Arnolfo di Cambio, and then grew even larger under Talenti. So again, these are churches that are growing larger and larger as cities are becoming more ambitious and are showing their pride in their city. Here's an interior. You can see that it retains some of the Gothic characteristics, pointed arches, a system of groin vaulting. So we're still in this transition period with some of these Gothic elements remaining with us. All right. Oh, excuse me. Okay, so I'll stop there.